And let's talk about this. Joining us now, our NBC News correspondent, Carol Lee from Washington, Raf Sanchez from Lviv, also with us, Ravi Agrawal, editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy, and retired General Steph Twitty, the former deputy commander of United States European Command. General, let me start with you. Your reaction to the president's statement today. $800 million, according to him, signed last week. $800 million additional military support to Ukraine this week, and then another $500 million to the Ukrainian government. How significant is this?
So, Jose, we're over $3 billion now of military aid to Ukraine. This is significant because, go back to what the president said, the Ukrainians now, they have to be on the offense, which means they need the equipment to be able to use in the offense. Stuff like artillery that you heard him talk about, the drones and so forth. They're going to have to strike the Russians hard and deep. The Russians have massive artillery. They have massive tanks. This is going to be a land battle of attrition. And we need to be able to give the Ukrainians what they need to compete in this fight. This is a good start. I would have loved to hear more about attack helicopters. Of course, that takes a long time to train up on if you're going to give them American. So I'm not an advocate of giving them American helicopters. But the MiG-17s or Mi-17s and the attack helicopters that they've used in the Soviet military, those would have been great to hear about, as well as additional tanks instead of armored personnel carriers, which are great. They're going to need tank capability as well. And then I'm an advocate of giving them the MiG-29s that you've heard so much about. That way, we can have somewhat of a level playing field here as they go into this battle that's going to be brutal.
Yeah, General, I mean, they've so far, as we understand it, just pretty much given them just a handful of Mi-17s. But then, General, you know this better than anybody else. I mean, there are a lot of attack helicopters that are part of the old Soviet system, the Mi-24s. There are a lot of helicopters that could make a more substantial difference in that war right now that the Ukrainians don't have access to. Raf, you're in Lviv. How do you think this aid is going to help what is so desperately needed now in Ukraine, both militarily and also on the civilian side?
Well, Jose, let me start by saying that as the President of the United States was speaking, as he was recalling the Ukrainians' victory in the Battle of Kyiv, the air raid sirens started going off here in Lviv. They've just stopped a moment ago. We don't know yet whether this was another attack on this western city or if it was a false alarm. But either way, it is a reminder that the Russian president is able to threaten every corner of this country. Now, I think one of the most important things that President Biden said from a Ukrainian perspective is that this new $800 million package is not a generic military package. It is closely tailored to what Ukraine needs for this new fight in the East. He said it is responsive to what the Ukrainian military needs for a battle that they say is going to look more like the Second World War, large formations of tanks and artillery going up against each other. One number that jumped out at me, Jose, the president said the U.S. will be providing 144,000 rounds of badly needed artillery ammunition. That's about 4 times as much as was provided in the last military aid package. And that will last the Ukrainian military at this current intense rate of fighting 3 weeks or more, which, you know, isn't a lot, but is enough to keep them going for the moment. President Zelensky said overnight that he was cautiously optimistic that the United States and its allies not only understood what kind of weapons the Ukrainian military needs, but also understood the fierce urgency with which they needed them. And I think now we have a sense of why he made those comments, that the United States is very clear about the kind of fighting that the Ukrainians are doing in the East, very clear about what they'll need. Jose, I'll also say the president became a little emotional as he was talking about the human cost of this war. He repeated that statistic that you and I have talked about. 2/3 of Ukraine's children have been displaced over these 2 months of fighting. The president called it an absolute outrage. And it is a reminder that as we talk about the military hardware needed in the East, it is the civilians of this country who are paying the price for what the president called Putin's conquest. Jose?
Well, thank you so very much, and important what you point out, those 3 weeks, which is so significant. Carol, the president also saying that he would be going to Congress next week for a supplemental on the Ukrainian weapons issue. What's the thinking from the White House about military aid going forward, and is there continuing unity in the Congress to support this level of assistance for Ukraine?
I think the thinking, Jose, is that it needs to, as the president said, the military needs to have a steady flow into Ukraine. We've seen so far that in Congress, there's bipartisan support for more military aid and funding for Ukraine. The president said that the amount that he's going to request is still being sorted out, but that he will be making this request next week. And one of the things that he highlighted in his remarks was that, in his words, that we're at a critical window in this conflict where the U.S. and its allies need to get Ukraine as many weapons as they possibly can to try to fend off this new as the war moves into this new phase. So you have this $800 million on top of $800 million last week, but the president saying that in order to sustain Ukraine in this war, that he's going to need more money from Congress. There were a couple other announcements, Jose, that the president made in his remarks, that $500 million in economic assistance. That comes after the White House announced the president met with the prime minister of Ukraine this morning, and that the prime minister would be meeting with other cabinet officials, including the Treasury Secretary. The president announced a new process for Ukrainians who want to come to the U.S., that's being rolled out, and a ban on Russian-affiliated ships in U.S. ports. So the whole of his remarks, there was a number of things in there. Obviously, the military aid is the biggest ticket item in his comments, and the thing that is going to get the most attention and will be most well received in Ukraine. But the president also, at the end of his remarks, thanked the American people. This is something that this is a lot of money that's flowing to Ukraine at a time where there's economic hardships here at home. And the president tried to make the case that, look, this is our responsibility as a country to do this. And because of you, American people, that the U.S. is able to do this for the Ukraine. So a lot there. We still need to see the details of what exactly is in this military aid package, but the president saying that this is just the beginning of much more that needs to come.
Yeah, I'm also glad that he was able to answer a question about Title 42. We'll talk about that later in this hour. But, Ravi, I'm just thinking the president insisted and a couple of times at the unity that exists within, for example, Western Europe, NATO, and the president insisted under American leadership. Ravi, how united is the Western world on this issue?
That's a great question, because that's the third tentpole of Biden's speech right now. The first, of course, was that U.S. aid is dynamic, so it changes according to the situation. Now it's focused on the East, different topography. The second is that he will ask for more when it's needed. He'll have to go back to Congress, so the aid isn't unending. But the third, as you just pointed out, is Western unity. Western unity, of course, has been a big part of Biden's attempts to try and prove to Putin, and he said it again right now, that Putin is banking on the West losing interest. We are going to prove him wrong. Those were his exact words. The thing, though, however, and this is interesting because he said Western unity. He didn't point to global unity. And I think that's where the cracks really exist, because much of the rest of the world, if you look at the population of the world, India and its neighbors, which is about a quarter of the world's population, add in China, you're close to half of the world's population. These are all countries that not only have refused to condemn Russia so far, but they are actually increasing their purchases of Russian oil and gas. India, for example, has purchased more Russian crude in the last month than it has in all of 2021. And I think this is where a lot of the administration's diplomacy over the next few weeks will be very important, because you can't moralize to these countries. They're going to say, we're going to get a good deal when we see one. But red lines will likely have to be drawn if Putin escalates, if chemical weapons or nuclear weapons are on the table. I think that's where the question of not just Western unity, but global unity will become so much more important.
Ravi Agrawal, Ralph Sanchez, Carol Lee, retired Lieutenant General Stephen Twitty, thank you so much for being with us.